The French Revolution, which spanned from 1789 to 1799, stands as one of history's most transformative and at the same time tumultuous periods. Before the Revolution, French society was plagued with inequality, financial crisis, and widespread hunger. When the revolutionary thoughts first started to rise, it promised ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. However, as with most revolutions, the path to these ideals was neither straightforward nor without its dark chapters. See, France, right before the revolution started, was a nation on the brink. The opulence of the monarchy and the nobility was a pretty harsh contrast to the poverty that was faced by the general public. After the nobility kept ignoring the bad situation of the populace, ideas of a revolution started to uprise. The initial phases of the revolution were marked by the fall of the Bastille and the abolition of feudalism, and while everything looked smooth at the beginning, the revolution was soon overshadowed by social problems. Despite the revolution being in progress, economic hardships persisted, and the initial optimism about it started to shift into disillusionment. As the revolution kept going, radical factions like the Jacobins began to gain more and more power. Their rise absolutely destroyed the ideas of moderate reforms, and they went on to more extreme measures. The Reign of Terror set the stage for a period that nobody that started the revolution thought was possible. The streets that once echoed with cries for liberty began to cast shadows of fear. Prisons, which had once been the symbols of royal authority, were now repurposed and used by the Reign of Terror to make their own justice. But what was life like for the prisoners in there during the French Revolution? What did the Reign of Terror do to those who were seen as traitors? This is exactly what we are going to find out in today's video. So make sure to stick around until the end so you don't miss a single detail that was never even talked about in history class. As I already said, after the successful start, the French Revolution started to spiral into a fight for power and radical ideologies. Central to this shift was the rise of radical revolutionary groups, with the most notable being the Jacobins. Originating as a political club, the Jacobins, under leaders like Maximilien Robespierre, they got popular by telling everybody that they wanted to protect the rights of the common people and advocated for a republic. With promises like these, their influence grew rapidly, and by 1893 they had taken control of the revolutionary government. However, with this shift in popularity, the power dynamics also changed, and quickly they started coming up with more radical and uncompromising methods to the revulsions. Historians today believe that one of the main drivers that got them to radicalize was that the Jacobins feared counter-revolutionary plots and external threats. This initiated what came to be known as the Reign of Terror. From 1793 to 1794, France was gripped by this reign, and the general public was constantly in suspicion and fear. The Jacobins changed the meaning of the guillotine. Initially, it was seen as a symbol of egalitarian justice, but later it became an instrument of mass execution. Thousands of people were accused of being enemies of the revolutions, and therefore they met their end on the scaffold. The criteria on why someone got executed were extremely broad and often arbitrary, and a lot of the time it not only hit the nobility and the clergy, but also revolutionaries who were not radical enough. To oversee and manage their political purge, the Jacobins established the Committee of Safety. Initially, it was an instrument to defend the external threats from other European monarchies, but it really quickly became the real executive government of France. Its role became to encompass internal surveillance, rooting out dissent, and ensuring the loyalty of the populace. It didn't take long until it had absolute power and no longer relied on traditional checks and balances. Therefore, it also controlled the Revolutionary Tribunal, which was a court instituted to try political offenders and ensure swift and brutal justice. The combination of the radical ideology, the climate of fear, and the unchecked power became a situation where imprisonment was not just a punitive measure, but also a tool for total political control. These prisons were completely filled with inmates, and it set the stage for the most brutal of scenarios in French history. Looking at the prisons at that time, we can definitely say that the prisons in France already were at maximum capacity before the Reign of Terror started, and this got even worse after the Jacobins got to power. Sure, there have been a lot of people set free by the new government, but it doesn't even come close to the number of people who were newly imprisoned during that time. With the number of prisoners skyrocketing, these detention centers were overwhelmed, and they even started repurposing monasteries and convents. The conditions inside these prisons were unimaginable. Overcrowding was rampant, with many cells holding several times the inmates that were usually intended. Ventilation was poor, leading to stiff and fetid air. Basic amenities such as bedding were scarce, and many were forced to sleep on cold and wet floors. Sanitation facilities were grossly inadequate, and the numbers of diseases went through the roof. Food at that time was scarce in all of France, so you can imagine that inmates most of the times got nothing. And when it was provided, it was often meager and of poor quality, leading to malnutrition among inmates. One of the personal accounts we can look at that paint a vivid picture of the daily horrors faced by prisoners comes from Jean-Baptiste Clary, who was the personal valet of King Louis during his imprisonment. Clary wrote of the constant surveillance, the meager rations that were sometimes infested with vermin, and the separation of his family. Another prisoner, Rosalie Duclos, spoke of the constant dread of the daily roll calls, where names were read out for execution, and the horrifying sound of prison keys, which signaled the list of today's executions has arrived. Looking at the people who got imprisoned, we can definitely see that the Reign of Terror did not only focus on the nobility, they basically targeted everybody who was a perceived enemy of the revolution, and basically anybody had to fear to get in their aims. Neighbors started betraying their own neighbors, and farmers and craftsmen stopped working out of fear of being deemed as traitors. So there you can clearly see that everybody that the Jacobins didn't like was at fear of getting a trial and then executed, because these trials haven't been fair at all. The most notable person who was brought to trial was King Louis. After a failed attempt to flee from a prison and perceived treachery against the revolution, he was tried and executed in January 1793. His death symbolized the definitive end of the Bourbon monarchy. Months later, Queen Marie Antoinette, who is often painted as the embodiment of royal excess, met a similar fate. But as I said earlier, the terror did not stop with the aristocrats. Even notable revolutionary figures found themselves at fear of getting executed. Georges Danton, a leading figure in the early days of the revolution, was executed on charges of corruption and leniency towards enemies of the revolution. Camille Desmoulins, a journalist and close friend of Danton, and once a huge advocate for the revolution, also met his end at the guillotine. And even Maximilien Robespierre, the former head of terror, couldn't escape from it. His execution in July 1794 marked the end of the Reign of Terror's most intense phase. However, the randomness and unpredictability of arrests were probably the most terrifying aspect of this period. I mean, everybody could easily be prosecuted at that time, and accusations could arise from personal revenge, misunderstandings, or suspicion. The Revolutionary Tribunal often relied only on hearsay, and the quote-unquote evidence needed for a death sentence was shockingly trivial at times. A casual word spoken against the revolution, a perceived lack of enthusiasm for the revolution, or even just the association with a suspect could seal one's fate. And just by looking at the numbers, the scale of the Reign of Terror becomes clear. Between September 1893 and July 1794, which was the most intense phase of the terror, it's estimated that around 17,000 individuals were tried and executed by the guillotine. This number is based on official records of the Revolutionary Tribunal. However, when we take a look at all of France at that time, there were people that got executed without trial, and then this number rises significantly, with some suggesting a total of 25,000 to 40,000 deaths. In Paris, which was the epicenter of the revolution, the population witnessed the highest concentration of executions. Approximately 2,600 people met their end in the capital alone. In regions like the Vendée, where a lot of counter-revolutionary actions led to uprisings, mass executions were carried out in response to perceived threats. It's also worth noticing that the guillotine wasn't the only method of execution. Mass drownings, especially in places like Nantes, added to the death toll. Additionally, countless others died in prisons due to the bad conditions without ever facing any trial. Luckily for the French citizens, the Reign of Terror was not able to sustain itself indefinitely. The very mechanisms that fueled their reign began to backlash on them and set the stage for its eventual end. The political landscape of revolutionary France at that time was fraught with alliances and betrayals, with the most notable one being Maximilien Robespierre. He has once been the revolution's most vocal advocate and was the head of the Reign of Terror. However, over the months, he found himself increasingly isolated. His constant push for purges, even within the Committee of Public Safety and the Jacobin Club, made many people ask themselves if they are really doing the right thing. His downfall was probably his insistence on the controversial law of 22 Prairial, which aimed to make executions faster by taking AW. Many people were hesitant about that law, and nobody could understand why they insisted on that. As the executions increased and became more and more arbitrary, even those that have been at the front of the revolutions feared that they might be the next on Robespierre's list. The turning point was on the 27th of July, 1794, when Robespierre and his close allies got arrested by the members of the National Convention. When he tried to defend himself, he was shouted down. At first, Robespierre tried to escape and take refuge in the Hôtel de Ville in Paris, however. His enemies were able to arrest him quickly. A day later, he once again tried to somehow get support by as many people as possible, but ultimately it failed, and he was executed on the same day, together with his closest allies. Looking at accounts of that time, they were able to feel the relief of this period, and the fear of arbitrary arrest and execution began to slowly fade away. However, the end of terror did not mean the end of the revolution. The political vacuum left France in a very volatile state. In 1795, the Thermidorian reaction established a new directory to stabilize France. This committee only consisted of 5 members, and they tried to politically and economically get France back on the right track. While they faced their own set of challenges like corruption and economic difficulties, their timeline was marked by a pretty solid stabilization, at least compared to the tumultuous years of the Reign of Terror. However, their control over France also only lasted 4 years, and in 1799, it was overthrown by Napoleon Bonaparte, which set the stage for a new chapter in French history. Thank you for joining us today at Past Perspective as we dived into the horrifying things that happened to prisoners during the time of the Reign of Terror. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss another video. With that being said, thanks for watching, and until next time.